Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to this special edition of Conspiracy Corner News. This is the John Barbour interview, part 2. You may remember John Barbour. He's best known for creating the reality TV show Real People, which I really enjoyed as a teenager. Hate to put some years on you there, but it was a very popular show, so that's why he was called the Godfather of reality television. Another film he's known for, one of my favorite and least known comedians, Ernie Kovacs. He wrote and narrated a documentary for Ken Burns about Ernie Kovacs called Television's Original Genius. So we're on the same page there too. But today we're going to talk about the 1992 documentary, the JFK Assassination, the Garrison tapes, and a more recent version of that as well, about how the second assassination of JFK also assassinated the media as well. And so with me today is Bob Wilson from New York, and he's a big investigator as well into the JFK assassination. So I'll let you start there, Bob, with our first question.
Welcome, gentlemen. And my favorite documentary had been, honestly, I'm not saying this because of the guest, was the Garrison tapes. And I didn't realize initially that it was done by John Barbour. But now we've just been given, streaming on Amazon.com, where you can find it easily, is the Garrison tapes part 2, which features on the media basically savaging President Kennedy's memory and the truth about his killing, and they haven't picked up the ball. And something jumped out at me in the new documentary that I hadn't known. First, Bill O'Reilly had told us no less than 9 agents had penetrated Garrison's investigation. Now we find out there was I believe the name is the Roca memo. And in that memo it says that the agency believed there was a case against Clay Shaw, and if they didn't intercede, that Jim Garrison may indeed have gotten a conviction. And I didn't know of this, so I have to ask the man who brought this to me, John Barbour. Could you tell us a little bit about that Roca memo?
That memo came about as a result of the impact of Oliver Stone's film, JFK. As a matter of fact, I could have never done the Garrison tapes, the original, had Oliver Stone not made JFK, and I certainly could not have done part 2, which is called The American Media in the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, when there are 2 important highlights, or 3 important highlights in the murder of John Kennedy. And of course, the most important highlight would be the announcement in 1967 by Jim Garrison that they had solved the case when he arrested Clay Shaw. And indeed, he had solved the case. But when he got into his investigation, he was savaged illegally by the media and by the government, which broke numerous laws. The media broke numerous laws, especially NBC, which tried to bribe Perry Raymond Russo, who was Garrison's main witness, proving that Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald had met at Ferry's place and talked about crossfire in the murder of John Kennedy. And NBC sent a crew down to bribe Perry Raymond Russo. They had gotten him a job at $50,000 a year in California. And Perry Raymond Russo had come forward because when he had read that Clay Shaw had been arrested and he was at that party, he didn't want to be implicated. So he just showed up and said, hey, I was at the party and I could verify, but I'm not a part of this conspiracy. Anyway, when he was going to be interviewed by NBC, he reported this to Garrison, and Garrison had him taped. And as a result of this, Garrison brought criminal charges against NBC. There should have been 6 people at NBC, including David Sarnoff, the president, in jail for that horrible, horrible obstruction of justice in the most heinous murder in American history. And plus, NBC should have been denied their license thereafter. They should have literally been put out of business. So that was the very first major impact. The second major impact was the screening of the Zapruder film in 1975. Now, we all saw and of course it's reenacted and re-shown in the documentary. Dan Rather, 1963, the day after the assassination, he goes on CBS and he says he just seen this film. He describes everything that Jackie is wearing, the pink outfit, the pillbox hat, the outfit that Connolly is wearing, and everything that John Kennedy is wearing. And then he says, 3 shots are fired. They say that a lot. CBS says that a lot. 3 shots are fired. And he says the 3rd shot hits him in the head, and he is thrown violently forward. Well, I've had 100 really bright Americans ask me, John, how could anybody believe that nonsense in 1963? And I told them everybody believed the media in 1963. We didn't know it was nonsense until we saw Geraldo Rivera in 1975 on his late night show with Dick Gregory actually show the Zapruder film. So that was the second big blockbuster moment in the Kennedy assassination. And what happened is that the public demanded, forget the Warren report, let's have an absolutely new investigation. Well, the crime would have been solved by the man who was first appointed to head this, because hundreds of thousands of people stormed Congress with letters and phone calls and telegrams saying we need a real investigation. This will never be told to you by anyone, but you will see it in the film, and we have found the footage of Richard Sprague. Richard Sprague was a tough Philadelphia lawyer who'd gotten a lot of great convictions of mobsters and teamsters. He said publicly, we will solve this crime. He had a staff of 6, and he said, we are not going to hire any investigators from either the CIA or the FBI, because these are the agencies that we are going to investigate, and I guarantee you we will solve this crime. What happened immediately? The Central Intelligence Agency, with all their assets in the media, which started with Project Mockingbird, which is seen in the film, how they take over the media to create fake wars and a foreign policy, but we'll get to that in a minute. Members of Congress, members of the Senate, working for the Central Intelligence Agency, got rid of Richard Sprague. And then they appointed a hack named G. Robert Blakey, who turned the entire proceedings over to the CIA, published this horrible book in which he says the mafia did it, and then he thanks the CIA for their help. Now, I am telling you, you know and I know, if the mafia had killed John Kennedy, there wouldn't be a pizza parlor in America. There wouldn't even be an Italian in America, for crying out loud. So that was that major moment. The third major moment was the movie JFK. Now, you might all remember when it was announced that Oliver Stone had bought On the Trail of the Assassins, which was Jim Garrison's book, a brilliant book, by the way, and was going to turn it into a film. He was immediately attacked by the Washington Post, which had already been taken over by Project Mockingbird, as had NBC and CBS and ABC. We point out all the publications, and we name names in the film, including our treasured Reader's Digest. All of them being infiltrated and run by the Central Intelligence Agency. There wasn't one major periodical in America that stood up and say, hey, no, we can't have an intelligence apparatus interfering with the free press in America, which you saw in the church hearings, which we show in the film, that they had 400 paid assets in the 1970s writing news for all of these periodicals, and that's why we ended up with the fake Gulf of Tonkin resolution and that great fake war, the Vietnam War, and probably the biggest fake war, according to Jim Garrison, the Cold War against the Soviet Union. As Garrison says in the film, the Russians lost 25 million people. They had no reason to be fighting us. They had nothing to fight us with. But you see, the Depression in America was not saved by Roosevelt's New Deal. It was only saved by World War II. And as Garrison points out, if you get 1.5 million men coming back to the United States, how many refrigerators can they make? How many cars can they make? How many radios can they make? They can't make enough to sustain the economy. But if they continue making bombs and airplanes, you can blow up a bomb in a day and need a new one. It's not like a new car where you need a new car every year. And Garrison says in the movie, there were elements in the media, which I won't name, who were complicit with the Central Intelligence Agency before Dallas, aided the Central Intelligence Agency in the murder of John Kennedy, and after the execution of John Kennedy, all of the media surrounded the wagons and protected the known murderers of John Kennedy. That was the birth of fake news, which infests us today. So what happens is the Congress is again deluged by Americans who see JFK. They want the files released. Well, Congress is forced to sign the Assassinations Act, thanks to Oliver Stone's film. And one of the first memos released, we show at the very top of the film, and this is the memo that you're talking about, Bob. The memo dated 1967 proves that Jim Garrison did indeed solve the case when he arrested Clay Shaw and said on the Johnny Carson show. Again, you see this in the film. He's looking right into camera, and he said elements of our Central Intelligence Agency of our government murdered our president. He solved it. Well, this memo says we must help Clay Shaw. Otherwise, Jim Garrison is going to get a conviction of him. What a lot of people do not realize, and again you see it in the film. Film's called The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I made it available to every American for only $1.99 because every American should see it. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why some should not see it. But in any event, that is the birth of that memo, and that is why the memo was released.
If I want to ask you a question here, John.
Go ahead.
When I saw Dan Rather, which I didn't know, this happened a year before I was born, at that, again, no one saw the Zapruder film, which I take for granted. No one saw it until 1975, 12 years later, and then we're shocked because Dan Rather describes it, and he says the Kennedy's head went forward, implying he was shot from behind, when the exact opposite is true. You can even see Dan Rather looking down. He's ashamed that he's lying. He won't even look at the camera when he says it. But after hearing all of the assets that the CIA has everywhere in the media, are they, it may sound like a rudimentary or juvenile question, but are they Illuminati? Are they Skull and Bones? Or they have special rings or clubs? Or how can they have that? How can they have that many people working for them?
It doesn't matter whether they're Skull or Bones or Illuminati or anything. Jim Garrison named the names, and I'll tell you one of the absolutely wonderful things about the film, and I do hate to say this because it's my own movie. And William Matson Law, when he saw it in Los Angeles and he stood up in front of the audience, he almost cried. William Matson Law knows more about the non-autopsy at Bethesda than does David Lifton, who wrote that great book, Best Evidence. And William Matson Law said, I never thought I would see anything like this in my life. This is by far the greatest film about JFK ever made. What happens is that I don't want to lose my place here about this movie, but one of the really, really wonderful things about it, there are wonderful documentaries about the murder of John Kennedy. We saw The Men Who Killed Kennedy for a while on the History Channel until Bill Moyers forced them to stop airing it, because the last episode they blamed Lyndon Johnson, and that was the last time it was ever aired. Bill Moyers got together with Lady Bird Johnson, and they got the History Channel to not air it anymore. Okay, so but one of the wonderful things is this is the only movie that gives people a resolution to how you can solve this crime absolutely immediately, because all the facts are there. The House Select Committee, and Jim Garrison says it in the movie, they overturned the Warren Report, even though in 1993, after JFK, CBS trots out Dan Rather, and you see him in the film. And Dan Rather, and the narrator, myself, says quite honestly, over 90% of Americans do not believe Lee Harvey Oswald did it or acted alone. And then but then he says this with a straight face. He looks into the camera and he says the Warren Report has survived the test of time. The Warren Report did not survive the House Select Committee, which concluded 4 shots had been fired. And Garrison says the media never reported that. They didn't report the fact that it was turned over to the Justice Department, where it is an open but uninvestigated cold case. How simple is that? Just investigate it. What we have done, hold on, let me finish this. We have shown how people can demand justice immediately, because in the movie in 1980, when I did the interview, Garrison says, here's a list, John, of people who should be arrested and tried now. Of course, since 1980, a lot of them have died. But we put together a wanted poster of 10 alive today. At the end of the film, we deliver that wanted poster to the Justice Department, demanding they do their job. And the top 4, the first one is Dan Rather. I must tell you, I offered them $25,000 for one question I could ask of Dan Rather on camera, and that question was, Mr. Rather, who was in the room with you when you watched the Zapruder film, and what did they tell you to do? That's the one. They turned me down. We offered Bill Moyers $25,000. He's the guy that ordered the bubble top taken off after a rainy morning. You cannot work with Lyndon Johnson that long and not know what an evil, vile human being that man was. Probably the cruelest president we ever had, while the worst president we ever had was Bill Clinton. What a lot of people learn in the film. And I must tell you, we've had the best researchers watch this film and stand up afterwards and tell me they learned things. Do you know that in 1963, when John Kennedy was murdered, a company could only own 5 television stations? In 1963, there were 1,500 owners of television stations in America. But Bill Clinton signed the Communications Act around 1996 and turned 95% of all our media over to 6 corporations. These 6 corporations are still infiltrated by Project Mockingbird and the Central Intelligence Agency. That's why we are deluged to this day with the fake war on terrorism, the fake war on Iraq. We are absolutely inundated. We do not live in a democracy. Any political scientist, and all of them from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford have all said a year ago we no longer live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy. But what we did with this wanted poster, there's Dan Rather, there's Bill Moyers, and of course, there is George Bush Sr. George Bush Sr. was a major influence in the Central Intelligence Agency when John Kennedy was killed. The only man in America over 35 who does not remember where he was on November 22nd, 1963, when there are photographs of him in Dallas. Well, his oil company was called Zapata. The code name for the Bay of Pigs was called Operation Zapata, and two of the boats used were called the Barbour, which is his wife, and the Houston, which is where he had his oil company headquarters. This is proof that George Bush was a major player in the murder of John Kennedy. And then, of course, the fourth person that I say should be arrested, interrogated, or waterboarded is President Barack Obama. As President of the United States, it's like John Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs. He said, I am the highest elected officer in a democracy, and therefore I have to take the blame. And he took the blame, but he fired Allen Dulles. And again, after he was murdered, the first person Lyndon Johnson appoints is Allen Dulles, who wanted John Kennedy dead, and no one in the media opposed such nonsense, except after 9/11 when George Bush, another war criminal, appointed or wanted to appoint Henry Kissinger, another war criminal, to head up that investigation. The media did not resent the fact that this war criminal was going to investigate 9/11. The families who had 3,000 people murdered, and who knows who murdered them or how they murdered them, we won't speculate on that, but they raised such a fuss. Kissinger was kicked out, and George Bush would not testify under oath until he could sit on Dick Cheney's knee like a damn puppet, with Dick Cheney pulling the strings, and all of that stuff is secret. But I don't want to get into that. But I will tell you, now, Barack Obama had the opportunity to sign an executive order. He signed executive orders sending drones over to North Africa to kill a 16-year-old American boy. But he has not had the guts to sign an executive order demanding the release of all the documents. He has to be put under oath and questioned about why he did not do that, because the chances are Barack Obama was a CIA president. Now, I'm going to put that on pause a second, and I'm going to tell you something. I've had hundreds of people since the movie's only been out 2 weeks, and it's doing great only by word of mouth. Sadly, some of the major forces in this so-called assassination community, and I'm not going to name names, those who have written best-selling books about the assassination, not one of them has bothered to look at the film that their peers say is the best movie ever about JFK. And we announce that we have solved the crime and show how to bring justice. They purposely avoid it. Why should they recommend John Barbour's $2 film when they can sell a $20 book? But anyway, I've had hundreds of people ask me, who is in the shadow government? Who runs the shadow government? And Bob and Bart, this is my answer to them. The shadow government is the people that we elect every 4 years to the Senate, the Congress, and to the presidency. Because those that we elect have not been allowed to govern since they murdered John Kennedy in 1963. And you can see that right now with the problems that Donald Trump is having. And who knows how long Donald Trump will last. And on October 26th this year, Congress had mandated, because of the film JFK, that these files be released on October 26th. But it's up to the President of the United States. But right now, Donald Trump doesn't know how to run the country or what to do, because he doesn't have a problem with Putin. He has a problem with the Pentagon. They want perpetual war. And you can see that everyone, we show them in the film, everyone who is for peace. Robert Kennedy, murdered from behind. And the proof we show in the film is Dr. Noguchi's autopsy report. Sirhan was 6 feet in front of them. John Lennon was probably murdered. Malcolm X was probably murdered by the Central Intelligence Agency, and no question that Martin Luther King was murdered by the Central Intelligence Agency apparatus because he was going to create a 1 million-man poor person's march on Washington, D.C. What Martin Luther King realized, he realized, first of all, that the Vietnam War was fake, and secondly, more than that, he realized that the poor were being used as cannon fodder during the Vietnam War, and what had to change in America was not necessarily foreign policy, it was the economic makeup of America, and that the poor were growing, the middle class was shrinking, and the rich were getting richer. So he, in order to bring that to the attention of the public, he was going to organize a 1 million-man poor man march on Washington, D.C. And his attorney, who was a guest on my show, has a recording when he spoke at I Have a Dream, when he did that speech. The brass, the CIA and military intelligence people were standing on the roof and watching. And they were saying to one another, no black man should have that much power in this country. Well, shortly thereafter, he spoke in New York City at the Riverside Church, and I'm sure Bob is aware of this. This is the height of the Vietnam War. And the church was so crowded, they had to put speakers outside because there were 5,000 people on the street who wanted to listen to Martin Luther King. And over those loudspeakers, you can Google his speech, he said, I hate to say this, but the largest terrorist organization in the world is my government, and also my Pentagon. Well, a year later, they blew his brains out at the Lorraine Motel, and they've blown the brains out of everyone who advocated peace, and that goes back 2,000 years to the time of Jesus. They always get rid of the peacemakers. Okay, so Jimmy Carter said, now here's quite a religious man, who said, getting to the bottom of the John Kennedy murder will bring America back to what it once was. He wanted to appoint Ted Sorensen, a close aide to John Kennedy, as head of the Central Intelligence Agency, a civilian, to investigate the Central Intelligence Agency and investigate the murder of John Kennedy. And of course, the CIA assets in Congress and in the Senate, of course, voted him down, and they voted in the military man, Stansfield Turner. Shortly after that, Jimmy Carter was in Los Angeles, California, and there was an attempt on his life, which we outline in the film. And tell us about that moment in the film that stunned you, Bob.
Well, what you're saying is so profound to me, if I can lead into it just a little. You spoke of the secret government now becoming the overt government because they've lost close control of it, which I remember Fletcher Prouty talking about, who was in the documentary. But after Carter spoke up, he said he lost control of the government. I'm quoting your documentary, not my memory from things I looked into. I learned this from your work. But after he spoke up saying we need to solve Kennedy's murder to set the country straight, I paraphrase, 2 men were in a plot against him to kill him, and when I saw it in the documentary, I froze. Raymond Lee Harvey and Oswaldo Espinosa. If I was in Carter's shoes, I would be saying, geez, they're sending me a message. This is,
That's exactly right. And you know what it is? They are so powerful, they're expressing their very dark, sinister sense of humor. They were probably laughing their asses off in Langley, Virginia. As a matter of fact, I will tell you this, because this came from a number of sources. When Ronald Reagan was running for the presidency, his vice president was George Bush. Now, you remember there was an attempt on Reagan's life, which would have made Bush the president. Do you know, in the Central Intelligence Headquarters in Langley, Virginia, in the lobby, there was a huge poster of President Ronald Reagan and to his right, Vice President George Bush. And guess what? They had blacked out Ronald Reagan, so that all you saw on the poster was George Bush. That was an internal joke, but it wasn't so funny. But this is how powerful they become. And there's a wonderful moment in the film. Oh my God, I'm trying to think. We go to the House Select Committee, and the fella that was the head of Western Hemisphere operations for the Central Intelligence Agency,
David Atlee Phillips.
David Atlee Phillips. He was questioned by Robert K. Tannenbaum. This is the moment that proves the Central Intelligence Agency owns America, because Robert Tannenbaum was by far the most respected investigator. So he subpoenas David Atlee Phillips, and David Atlee Phillips is identified by a number of people as a guy seen in Dallas with Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is a guy that's head of Western Hemisphere relations. And again, we show him in the film talking about how easy it was to murder Arbenz, democratically elected, in Guatemala and Colombia, how easy it was to get rid of these people. Mossadegh in Iran, how easy it was to get. They're bragging about it. There's David Atlee Phillips, now the only guy standing in the way of the CIA's expansion into fake wars is John Kennedy, another head of state. Well, they had a program in the Central Intelligence Agency on how to kill heads of state, and it's called the Family Jewels. And as Jim Garrison said, it was a no-risk operation for them to murder John Kennedy. Anyway, Robert Tannenbaum, they subpoena at the House Select Committee David Atlee Phillips. And Tannenbaum's interviewing. And guess what David Atlee Phillips does? He gets up and he goes home to Garden. And Tannenbaum rushes to Congress and he says, he must be arrested. This is a congressional subpoena. And he's walked out on the subpoena. He went to the Justice Department. They declined to issue a warrant to arrest him for violating a legal subpoena. So what did Robert K. Tannenbaum do? He resigned and went home. And there is a great moment in the movie when you see this great map of the United States, and it says USA. And then you hear 4 gunshots, and the USA changes to CIA. And that's where we are today. And this crime has already been solved, but as James Corbett said, who just does a wonderful Corbett report, and in the documentary, there is a person on this. We have great people on the street, but there is one person on the street who says, I don't watch the news anymore. I watch that for entertainment. But if I want the real news, I go to the internet. So we show you people on the internet to whom you could tune in and listen to. And one of them is James Corbett. And James Corbett says, these things will never be solved because there is no one in position of authority in government or in law enforcement like District Attorney Jim Garrison. So this justice will never be served in America, even though we know who the criminals are.
Well, they certainly, as you said, haven't picked it up, since the House Select Committee left it an open case and recommended they pick it up. Before I hand over to Bart, if I can ask one question. I know you understand this very well, but as some of us try to grasp it, your insight helps us. You might take it for granted. But you talked about Eisenhower and his speech on the military-industrial complex, and then we have just the military. for those of us that are trying to grasp some of these things, could you just give us a simple explanation of the difference between the military and the military-industrial complex?
Well, there is no difference. They're all intertwined. As a matter of fact, I would go beyond saying it's the military-industrial complex. It is the banking, military, intelligence, industrial complex. That's what runs America. And one of the things that people learn, the Federal Reserve is not a Federal Reserve. It's a consortium of 6 private banks. There are 5 families that own the Federal Reserve. It's not American at all. And what John Kennedy did early in 1963, he signed an executive order, which we see in the film 11110, and it calls for the Treasury to print silver certificates. People, at that time, the interest rate was about 12 or 18%. But people who needed money could go to their own government, the Treasury, get a loan and only pay back like 2% or 2.5%. Had this continued, it would have put out of business the private banking cartel known as the Federal Reserve. He is shot in Dallas around noon. Before he dies at 1 o'clock, the printing presses stop. No president since then has had the courage to re-sign that order, which has never been rescinded. The Treasury should still be printing money and put out of business the Federal Reserve. So we have, democracy in America. We have a couple of wonderful quotes in the film, a couple of them by Mark Twain. But Mark Twain said 100 years ago, if voting made a difference, they wouldn't let us do it. Now, he said it is a joke, but it's no joke. I own some General Motors stock. So every once in a while, I vote, when I'm supposed to vote on General Motors. But I have no say over the design of the car or how many miles the carburetor gets. Well, that is the same when you vote for any of these 2 reprehensible candidates. They are both, one is the right wing and one is the left wing of a vulture. That vulture used to be the American eagle. When Martin Luther King said we were the greatest terrorist organization in the world, he was absolutely right. Look at Venezuela's not invading anybody. North Korea is not invading anybody. Iran is not invading anybody. We're invading everybody. And anybody who doesn't see that and recognize it is an absolute idiot. We have become what Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union, the evil empire. And these people do not think they are doing evil. It's like during the Second World War, before the Second World War, when the Nazis were rounding up Jews and homosexuals and socialists and sticking them into gas ovens. They did not think they were doing anything evil. They thought that they were the bug man, getting rid of these vermin and these lice that would improve the planet. St. John Hunt, the son of E. Howard Hunt, spoke. He gave a wonderful speech at Judith Baker's conference last November in Dallas. And he said, my father said to me, son, we were saving America from a commie. We were saving America, who was somewhat a threat to the American way of life. They all think they did good. They did not think they did evil. So for you people or anybody to call them evil, maybe what they did is evil because they killed a really decent man who was trying to stop these wars. But they did not think they were evil. They just did not. But in essence, they were. And we name them in the film. And nobody's brought a lawsuit against me yet.
Well, the truth is its own defense, right?
The truth is its own defense. It is the best defense. The truth is always the best defense. Jim Garrison used to say, one man armed with the truth is no army is any match for one man armed with the truth. Sadly, he had the truth, but he was no match for the army that was the Central Intelligence Agency that murdered him.
What hope do you see?
I'll let Bob go ahead. I'm sorry.
John, what hope do you see for America? Is the CIA just going to keep running the show until the end of time, or do you think there's any way of overcoming it?
It will implode. There will be nothing. You know, we opened the movie with a really wonderful picture of John Kennedy talking about how we must have a free information of facts in order for a democracy to work. And if we don't have that, it means the government's afraid of the people. So we don't have that now. We close the film with another picture of John Kennedy and another great quote. And he said, "Those who do not allow peaceful revolution make violent revolution inevitable." And it is becoming inevitable right now. And it'll be a lot closer to it come October 26th, when we find out whether or not Donald Trump feels strong enough to release all the final document about the murder of John Kennedy. And I assure you, you will not get those documents, and the ones you get will be so severely redacted you won't even be able to read them. It is all very simple, and it is all there in the movie. Now, I must tell you, I told some people in the audience they should not see this film. And the reason they should not see this film is we have been turned into political, inactive zombies in this country by our media and by our government. And the proof of this is very simple. We all know and all knew that weapons of mass destruction was a bunch of bullshit from George Bush and Dick Cheney and Condoleezza Rice and Powell. It was all rubbish. And because of that, millions of Americans took to the streets in Washington and New York and San Francisco and Chicago and Miami. Millions. And they could not stop the lie of the invasion of Iraq and the brutal war criminal murder of the leader of that country, Saddam Hussein, who at one time was a CIA asset, and at one time somebody to whom we delivered gas so he could kill the Kurds. And the same thing happened with Libya, with Gaddafi. They murdered Gaddafi. And probably one of the most reprehensible things I ever saw in my life from a politician was Hillary Clinton being interviewed about the murder of Gaddafi. And on camera she says, "We came, we saw, he died." Like the Wicked Witch of the North. Now, if I had been Bernie Sanders and I kept writing Bernie Sanders letters, if you want to eliminate Hillary Clinton as your opposition for the presidency, you run that piece of footage and tell the people this is the kind of person you want in the White House? A madwoman? Absolutely not. But it turned out I was right when I said a year and a half ago Bernie Sanders would turn out to be the Democrats' Ron Paul. He would turn and run, and he did. There is no hope politically. So forget politics. There's no hope politically. There is only one thing that could happen tomorrow that could change America instantly. And Donald Trump has talked about the fact that he was going to repeal NAFTA. NAFTA is not what he should repeal. He said, well, I'm going to repeal NAFTA so we can bring manufacturing back to the United States. That's the other thing that Bill Clinton did, is he got jobs out of the country to make profits for the organizations, the corporations, and there would be no place for young men to work. And so they had to go into the military and become killers for the bankers and the corporations, which they have done very successfully. They also did that by dumbing them down. But the one thing, and the only thing that they could concentrate on, is repealing the Communications Act. They did this with motion pictures back in the 50s. They said that motion picture studios could not own the theaters in which they distributed and shown their films. So they divested them. No company in America should be allowed to own more than 7 television stations or 7 radio stations. This is the only way you create diversity. That's the only thing that happened. The other hopeful thing is, this is such a cesspool of celebrity society. It's a society that worships only celebrities. All the celebrities who are famous anti-war activists have been murdered or silenced, including somebody like Cindy Sheehan. You don't hear from her anymore. You don't hear from anybody anymore. You don't even know there was an anti-war movement. There is only one celebrity in America who could help us today, and that is Oliver Stone. Every November 22nd, Oliver Stone should say to people, we are going to make November 22nd America's Bastille Day. We're going to march 10,000 strong, 20,000 strong, 50,000 strong every year on the Justice Department until they release all the files. Otherwise, no one will do it. And if Oliver doesn't do it, I can understand. They might threaten his family, or maybe he's moved on to doing interviews with Putin and other world leaders and doesn't want to take that chance or has lost interest. But he is the only one that people would follow. Some might follow Dr. Cyril Wecht, but he's not famous enough.
Well, we really appreciate you talking with us a second time, and I watched your entire movie here, The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John Kennedy, and I'm sure as our listeners know now, and as I saw during the film that you produced, your passion and zeal for the truth, for what is right, for the, just incredible hypocrisy of our government, to have the Select Committee on Assassination verify there was a second gunman, and for that person to never once be on the 10 most wanted list. It's utter hypocrisy. I don't know how the government can continue a day beyond that, but here we are. And we just wanted to thank you. And Bob, do you have any last comments or anything you want to ask?
Just to say thanks, John, and everybody should watch this. I loved it, and I'm not just saying that. And I'd just like to ask, could you say something about the guy who you're bringing to light here, like your thoughts on having to met Jim Garrison and interviewed him and gotten to know him a bit? Could you tell us a little bit about him?
Jim Garrison was by far the most interesting, most intellectual, most humanitarian, most American Frank Capra human being that I had ever met. And some of the things that he says in the film would almost break your heart. It's just, you must see the film. And I must tell you, fellas, I am not a conspiracy theorist. I mean, when John Kennedy was killed, I thought I lost my act. Because most of my act was doing political jokes. I never thought I lost the president. I've always been a storyteller from the time I was 5 years of age. That is the thing that interests me. And when I stumble across accidentally, and all the great things in my life happen to me by accident, all the worst things were those things that are really planned well, is that Jim Garrison was just one of a kind. There will never be another Jim Garrison. And I'll tell you also how unintellectual America has become. We're running out of time, but I've spoken to hundreds and hundreds of college students, and not one, when I asked them, the intellectual founder of the American Revolution and the Constitution, the intellectual founder was Thomas Paine. Not one of them could tell me where Thomas Paine was buried. Not one. There's a Jefferson Memorial. There's a Washington Memorial. Where is a Thomas Paine Memorial? America has always been an anti-intellectual country, which was proven with the election of George Bush. I mean, if you asked George Bush to talk about Jefferson, he'd probably say, it's a very good high school. I heard it's a good high school. So, anyway, there you go. But all you have to do is to see. Oh, I said that some people would be angry at me because the film tells them the truth. If you know the truth, as Jack Nicholson said in Few Good Men, you can't handle the truth. The problem is if you know the truth and you do nothing about it because you know you cannot do anything about it, you are going to hate the truth teller. You know, there's a 10,000-year-old Persian proverb, and that proverb is, if you're going to tell the truth, you better have one foot in the stirrup. And that's why I warn people, you better be careful about watching this film, because you're going to be so well informed, you are going to be compelled to do something about it. The thing that you should do first and foremost is never believe anything that your media or your government tells you. He was savaged illegally by the media and by the government, which broke numerous laws. The media broke numerous laws, especially NBC, which tried to bribe Perry Raymond Russo, who was Garrison's main witness, proving that Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald had met at Ferry's place and talked about crossfire in the murder of John Kennedy. And NBC sent a crew down to bribe Perry Raymond Russo. They had gotten him a job at $50,000 a year in California. And Perry Raymond Russo had come forward because when he had read that Clay Shaw had been arrested and he was at that party, he didn't want to be implicated. So he just showed up and said, hey, I was at the party and I could verify it, but I'm not a part of this conspiracy. Anyway, when he was going to be interviewed by NBC, he reported this to Garrison, and Garrison had him taped. And as a result of this, Garrison brought criminal charges against NBC. There should have been a half a dozen people at NBC, including David Sarnoff, the president, in jail for that horrible, horrible obstruction of justice. Dick Gregory actually showed the Zapruder film. So that was the second big blockbuster moment in the Kennedy assassination. And what happened is that the public demanded, forget the Warren report, let's have an absolutely new investigation. Well, the crime would have been solved by the man who was first appointed to head this, because hundreds of thousands of people stormed Congress with letters and phone calls and telegrams saying we need a real investigation. This will never be told to you by anyone, but you will see it in the film, and we have found the footage of Richard Sprague. Richard Sprague was a tough Philadelphia lawyer who'd gotten a lot of great convictions of mobsters and teamsters. He said publicly, we will solve this crime. He had a staff of 6, and he said, we are not going to hire any investigators from either the CIA or the FBI, because these are the agencies that we are going to investigate, and I guarantee you we will solve this crime. What happened immediately? The Central Intelligence Agency, with all their justice in the most heinous murder in American history, and plus NBC should have been denied their license thereafter. They should have literally been put out of business. So that was the very first major impact. The second major impact was the screening of the Zapruder film in 1975. Now, we all saw, and of course it's reenacted and re-shown in the documentary, Dan Rather, 1963, the day after the assassination, he goes on CBS and he says he just seen this film. He describes everything that Jackie is wearing, the pink outfit, the pillbox hat, the outfit that Connolly is wearing, and everything that John Kennedy is wearing. And then he says, 3 shots are fired. They say that a lot. CBS says that a lot. 3 shots are fired. And he says the 3rd shot hits him in the head, and he is thrown violently forward. Well, I've had 100 really bright Americans asked me, John, how could anybody believe that nonsense in 1963? And I told them everybody believed the media in 1963. We didn't know it was nonsense until we saw Geraldo Rivera in 1975 on his late night show with
and the truth about his killing and they haven't picked up the ball. And something jumped out at me in the new documentary that I hadn't known. First, Bill O'Reilly had told us no less than 9 agents had penetrated Garrison's investigation. Now we find out there was I believe the name is the Roca memo. And in that memo it says that the agency believed there was a case against Clay Shaw, and if they didn't intercede, that Jim Garrison may indeed have gotten a conviction. And I didn't know of this, so I have to ask the man who brought this to me, John Barbour. Could you tell us a little bit about that Roca memo?
That memo came about as a result of the impact of Oliver Stone's film, JFK. As a matter of fact, I could have never done the Garrison tapes, the original, had Oliver Stone not made JFK, and I certainly could not have done part 2, which is called The American Media in the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, when there are 2 important highlights, or 3 important highlights in the murder of John Kennedy. And of course, the most important highlight would be the announcement in 1967 by Jim Garrison that they had solved the case when he arrested Clay Shaw. And indeed, he had solved the case. But when he got into his investigation...
Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to this special edition of Conspiracy Corner News. This is the John Barbour interview, part 2. You may remember John Barbour. He's best known for creating the reality TV show Real People, which I really enjoyed as a teenager. Hate to put some years on you there, but it was a very popular show, so that's why he was called the godfather of reality television. Another film he's known for, one of my favorite and least known comedians, Ernie Kovacs. He wrote and narrated a documentary for Ken Burns about Ernie Kovacs called Television's Original Genius. So we're on the same page there too. But today we're going to talk about the 1992 documentary, the JFK Assassination, the Garrison tapes, and a more recent version of that as well, about how the second assassination of JFK also assassinated the media as well. And so with me today is Bob Wilson from New York, and he's a big investigator as well into the JFK assassination. So I'll let you start there, Bob, with our first question.
Welcome, gentlemen. And my favorite documentary had been, honestly, I'm not saying this because of the guest, was the Garrison tapes. And I didn't realize initially that it was done by John Barbour. But now we've just been given, streaming on Amazon.com, where you can find it easily, is the Garrison tapes part 2, which features on the media basically savaging President Kennedy's memory